And any suggestion that there could be an Israeli government ever that would allow the Palestinians anything more than limited autonomy on tiny little areas within the West Bank is completely misguided.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 22 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. Our whole program today will be the first part of a talk given by Miko Peled at the last Tree of Life conference. Peled speaks from a very unusual perspective. He's a supporter of Palestinian human rights, even though he's descended from the very cream of Israeli Zionist society. His father was a famous Israeli general. Another relative was President of Israel. Sadly, the family also is a victim of terrorism. Peled's niece was killed by a Palestinian suicide bomber. Yet Peled doesn't seek revenge. Instead, he looks for a larger justice for all Palestinians and Jews.
One of the most common remarks that I get from the book, and one that I consider a great compliment, is when people say that it's given them hope. And that people come up to me at the end of my lecture too, and they say that, that I've given them hope. And quite often I get asked, how is it that I can have hope when the situation is so grim? Well, seeing this meeting place this afternoon on a gorgeous day like today in Connecticut, and you're all here. And yesterday was a gorgeous day in New York, and there was a church full of people dedicated to listening and learning and participating in this process. And wonderful, inspiring people like David Good, who put this thing together, worked tirelessly, year after year after year. Yeah. How can you not be hopeful? How can we not be inspired? And then seeing student groups on campuses, excuse me, fighting against the odds, dealing with administrations that are hostile, dealing with the pro-Israeli groups that are hostile. And every year we see another group and another student group and another Palestine Awareness Week on more and more and more campuses around this country. How can you not be hopeful? And then seeing these wonderful Palestinians I've been traveling with for the last couple of days, far away from home, traveling, playing their wonderful music, speaking about these very, very, very important details like water that more than anything demonstrate just how severe the situation is. And caring enough to come out here and again travel and speak to people and so on. How can you not be hopeful? So I'm very hopeful because I see this, and this is part of, we're talking about the right to resist as the theme. This is part of the resistance. Events like this, people like yourselves, this is part of the resistance. This is the part of the Palestinian resistance. And I have to say that the previous speaker inspired me a great deal, and 2 down, 1 to go sounds great to me, and I'm stealing it. 2 down, 1 to go is going to be my motto. I think it's absolutely to the point, and it's absolutely true. 2 down, 1 to go. Still, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a complicated issue, not so much because it's complicated to find a solution. We've seen similar problems resolved in our lifetime, and I think the solution is really staring us in the face, but it's difficult because there's a lot of confusion, because there's so many different stories and so many different versions of the stories and so many contradictory books coming out, and everybody says something different. And I think it's important to maybe touch on some of those and maybe in the spirit of the Kairos, where we have to get rid of some of the myth and really take a good look at what this is all about. One of the things that people talk about a lot and is almost impossible to ignore is the issue of the Holocaust in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, where we hear 2 different claims. We hear one claim that Israel must, or the Jewish people must have the state of Israel, that the state of Israel must be strong and militarized because it is the only thing standing between Jewish people today and the Holocaust. On the other side, we hear the claim that or the question rather, how is it that people who have suffered so much now turn around and cause such pain to other people? Well, both of these things are not true. After World War II, there were about 2 million Jewish refugees in internment camps in Europe. Less than 10% of those actually immigrated to Israel. The vast majority stayed in Europe or came to America, even preferred to go back to Germany and reclaim their lives as Germans, rather than go to Israel. It's wrong to suggest that Holocaust survivors are complicit with the crimes of Israel against the Palestinians. And furthermore, it's wrong to say that Israel has anything to do with the Holocaust. Because if Jewish people, the very survivors of the Holocaust, felt that this was the right thing to do, they would have gone there. And the vast majority did not. I think only about 150 or 200,000 at the most actually immigrated to Israel, to Palestine. And many of those that did immigrate left. So I think it's important to clarify this and put this in perspective. There's a use, or I should say a misuse, a cynical misuse of the Holocaust in this context. And it's important to clarify that. And then there's this other issue where people say, well, those people over there have been killing each other for so long that it's really hopeless. As though to suggest that there's something genetically wrong about the people over there, and none of us can change that. So really none of us should get involved because it's hopeless, because it's those people over there. And besides being wrong, it's very dangerous because this is an attempt to get people to not act. This is an attempt to get people to not get involved. And this is one of those we talked about 2 down, 1 to go. It's only people that are going to get this one down. It's only people this problem was created by people, and it will be resolved by people. And it will be resolved by people like yourselves and others who care enough to get involved and to visit. By the way, how many people here have visited the Holy Land? Israel, Palestine. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. And if you've seen the place, how can you not be hopeful? It's such a beautiful country with such wonderful people. So it's hard not to be hopeful. And I would argue, let's see if this is working. Good. I would argue if we want to talk about the beginning of this conflict, or the beginnings of this conflict, a good time to take a look at is precisely the 29th of November, 1947, which is when the United Nations decided to partition Palestine. There was a Jewish community that wanted the land. There was an Arab community that wanted the land. The United Nations says, fine, we'll give them a piece, and everybody will be fine. Which is quite simplistic, and in a certain way, maybe it makes sense. But of course, it was very wrong. And again, if we look at the details and we try to really understand what took place, we get into trouble because the myths fall apart. So in 1947, there were about 500,000 Jews living in Palestine. This was a generation of my grandparents who immigrated, and my parents who were born there. And there were about 1.5 million Palestinians living there who were the natives of the land. Yet the United Nations in the partition plan gave the larger portion of the country to the smaller Jewish community. And the smaller portion to the larger Palestinian community, and somebody somehow expected that this is going to work. In fact, to this day, Palestinians are blamed for rejecting the partition plan. Because had they not rejected the partition plan, all would have been well by now. I don't know what they were thinking. But who would have accepted, which nation would have accepted a plan that slices off the larger portion of their country and hands it over to a community of immigrants who quite literally just came off the boat? So of course it was rejected. And from this point on, we have 2 stories that are diametrically opposed. We have 2 histories that are diametrically opposed. And quite often people look to find some kind of a balance, some kind of a way to bridge this, and you can't. When you have 2 opposing stories, you have 2 opposing stories. You have to make your own, engage in your own research and find out which of those 2 stories is true. And the story that I was brought up with, and the story that people are brought up with in America and in the West in general, says that after the Arabs rejected this plan, they began a massive assault against the Jewish community, intending to kill and destroy them. And then miraculously, because this Jewish community, they were the descendants of King David, and they were the descendants of the Maccabees and so on, they prevailed and they beat the Arabs against all odds, and the Jewish state was created once again in the land of Israel after 2,000 years. Who in their right mind would want to refute a story like this? Who would want to go against? How could you possibly go against a story that is so heroic and so romantic? Yet if we look at the details, once again, like I said, looking at the details is a very dangerous thing, because the myths fall apart and the story is suddenly not so romantic. So when we do look at the details, we see that these two communities that were there in Palestine, both wanting and hoping to be recognized as states, both of them had institutions of state, but there was one thing that the Jewish community in Palestine had invested in heavily that the Palestinians did not: an armed militia, a fighting force. By 1947, the Zionist militia, in which my father was an officer, numbered close to 40,000 well-trained armed men. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. So when we talk about 1947 and the rejection of the plan, of the partition plan, and the attack, the assaults against the Jews, who attacked? There was no militia. There was no armed militia. Which Arabs attacked exactly in 1947? We know that later on, other Arab armies intervened in Palestine. That was 6-7 months later. But at the end of 1947, who exactly was it? Well, it wasn't. As soon as the United Nations accepted the resolution to partition Palestine and gave a stamp to the existence, or its affirmation to the existence or the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, the Zionist militia began a massive campaign that today would be categorized as terrorism and ethnic cleansing. It was a campaign of terrorism and ethnic cleansing that lasted 12 months. An armed militia against a civilian, unarmed civilian population, at the end of which 80% of the country was conquered, or close to 80%. Hundreds and hundreds of towns and villages were destroyed, and close to 1 million Palestinians were forced into exile. It's not so romantic anymore, but now the pieces fit the puzzle. This is how it happened. Now, often we hear people claim, yes, well, perhaps there were a little destruction, perhaps the Zionists, there were a few Palestinians, but really they were uncivilized, they were nomads, they were poor farmers, and they really lost nothing. This is a picture of the city of Jaffa before 1948. And the smaller picture is a boulevard in Jaffa that actually still exists today. It was a city of over 100,000 people, with a rich business life, a rich political life, trade unions, newspapers, movie theaters, concert halls. It was a rich, important Arab city on the coast of the Mediterranean. In a matter of 2 weeks in 1948, the city of over 100,000 people was reduced to 4,000 people, concentrated in one neighborhood with barbed wire and Israeli guards surrounding them. And on the ashes of the city, we today have, almost from the exact same angle, this picture, the city of Tel Aviv. Jaffa was a Palestinian city, an Arab city with a Jewish neighborhood. Tel Aviv is a huge, major Israeli city with a small, neglected, oppressed Palestinian neighborhood. Palestine is more than just the West Bank and Gaza. The Palestinians who live in Jaffa, it's a different type of oppression, it's a different type of occupation. But in terms of their opportunities, in terms of the harassment, in terms of the oppression, it is just as bad, if not worse, in some cases, than the reality Palestinians live in the West Bank and Gaza. So we cannot reduce the Palestine issue to just the West Bank and Gaza. Of course, the price is still being paid today. People talk about the Nakba, the catastrophe that took place in 1948. The catastrophe that destroyed Palestine in 1948, as though it's something that happened in the past. This is a picture of children in a Palestinian refugee camp. Over 4 million Palestinians living in refugee camps. No running water, no electricity, no sewage system, no access to health care, no access to nutrition, no access to water that's fit for drinking. Now, this is not some remote mountain in Afghanistan. This is an hour drive maybe from Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, modern cities, many of which used to be Palestinian cities. The only reason these children have no access to these cities, where you wouldn't dream of seeing kids in this situation, you wouldn't dream of seeing Israeli children like this. The only reason they have no access is because they're not allowed to return. It's because they're not allowed to go back and live in these places because they're Palestinians. So the Nakba, the catastrophe, didn't take place in 1948. It began in 1948. It continues today. And it gets worse and worse by the day. Under our watch. Which is why this is so important. Now, there's a story in my book that I mentioned that I mentioned in the book that has to do with my mother. This is a picture of my mother when she was 22 years old. She's 87 now, and she was born and raised in Jerusalem. She still lives in Jerusalem. And there's a story that she told me many, many times when I was young about something that took place in 1948. And the story has to, she was living in Jerusalem at the time. She was already a mother, and she was living in a small apartment with her parents in Jerusalem. And I want to clarify, I'm not talking about the old city of Jerusalem. I'm talking about neighborhoods that were built outside the old city of Jerusalem in what became the Israeli side of Jerusalem later on. Now these neighborhoods, these homes are still there. These are wealthy, beautiful Palestinian neighborhoods, beautiful homes, which is probably why they're still there. And in 1948, the Zionist militia came, they took the neighborhoods, they forced the Palestinians to leave, and these homes were made available to Israeli families. And my mother was offered one of these homes. Now having lived in Jerusalem her whole life, she knew these neighborhoods, and she knew these families, and she knew these people. And she was shocked at the possibility that somebody would think that she would take a home that belonged to somebody else. And to this day, when she talks about that, she says this with the same emotion. How could I possibly take the home of another family? How could I possibly live in the home of another mother? And she refused. Now this is, it's a very good story, and of course we all would have hoped that we would have behaved as she did, although realistically most people didn't. But beyond that, there was something about this story that I found very troubling throughout my life. And it wasn't actually until I was working on the book that I could reconcile and get over this and understand what was troubling. Her story presented a moral dilemma in a reality that could not have been, there could not have been a moral dilemma. It contradicts the national narrative, the Zionist narrative. And the Zionist narrative is foolproof. It's perfectly moral. So how was she presenting a moral question in a story, in a reality where there could not have been one? Because the story that we learn is that they rejected the partition plan and they attacked us. Thankfully we won. They are the Arabs, of course. Then after we won, we begged them to stay and they left. We begged them to stay and they left. So not only did we accept the partition plan, even though we deserved the entire country, we accepted only a part of it. Not only did we ask them to stay and they left, now these homes are available and there's a family that needs a home. Where's the problem? There is no moral dilemma here because it's a perfect story. Even when Israeli children learn about massacres and atrocities committed by the Israeli forces, and they do. The story of the massacre in Deir Yassin, children learn about this in school books. Deir Yassin was a small village in the outskirts of Jerusalem. They surrendered when the Zionist forces came in 1948 and they were slaughtered. There was a terrible massacre. So Israeli children learned about this. That was wrong, women and children were killed. At the same time, as a result of this massacre, hundreds of thousands of Arabs left. And this allowed us to create a Jewish majority, which is a good thing. So even though the story was bad and the massacre was bad, there was a good outcome. You see, it's a perfect story. The Zionist narrative is always perfect. There is never a moral dilemma, even when we commit atrocities. And like I said, it wasn't until I was working on the book and I talked to my mother again and again about this that I could understand what it was that was so troubling to me. Now, between 1948 and 1967, this was the map. Israel had control over almost all of Palestine, with the exception of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And the Israeli military had wanted the Gaza Strip, the West Bank very much, and the Golan Heights. They thought it was a mistake not to take the West Bank in 1948, and they had coveted the Golan Heights for a very long time. And what we heard today about the water explains why. They wanted complete control over these resources, and they wanted control over the water resources particularly. And then in 1967, we had the Middle East the Middle East, the 1967 Middle East War, the Six-Day War. And once again, we hear that Israel was under an existential threat, that Arab armies were getting ready to destroy the state of Israel. And once again, these Israelis, these young Jews, who were the descendants of King David and the Maccabees and so forth, once again, they defeated the Arabs. My father was a general by that time, as were all the young officers of 1948, were then generals. And at the end of this war, I have a picture here of the entire Israeli High Command. They congratulated themselves on what they call finishing the job. What job did they finish? They finished the job of conquest of the land of Israel and a few other areas which kind of came with it, which was the Sinai, but particularly the Golan Heights. And now, 25 years or so after the Holocaust, the entire land of Israel was once again in Jewish hands. This was the story. And of course, they were very pleased with themselves. And in reality, this is what took place. Palestine was completely erased off the map, and it was included within the boundaries of the state of Israel. The water resources, the land, the heartland of biblical Israel, Bethlehem and Hebron and all these places, and of course, the crown jewel, which was the old city of Jerusalem. All of this was included in the land within the state of Israel, and immediately, and I mean immediately, when the conquest was complete in 1967, the conquest of the West Bank, Israel began, or I should say continued, the destruction and the ethnic cleansing and building exclusively for Israeli Jews in the West Bank, just like they had done in other parts of Palestine. In other words, this was not they didn't see this as some separate entity, as some separate place. They continued, they went on with what follows after the conquest, which is destroying cities and towns, expelling hundreds of thousands of people, and building for Israeli Jews in the West Bank just like they did everywhere else. The conclusion can only be that on that day when Israel took the West Bank, it had established a single state over the entire country. It's a binational state because we have Israelis and Palestinians, and with exclusive rights for Jewish people. Whether it's travel, whether it's citizen rights, whether it's water, you name it. Exclusive rights for Jewish people in this state that's really a binational state. It's not a Jewish state because half the population now is not Jewish, and most Jewish people, of course, don't live there. And it's not a democratic state because the other half, the non-Jewish half of the state, aren't counted. They don't participate in the process. Never mind that they have no access to the resources. But on that day, they completed the conquest and they created the state of Israel that they had wanted. And any suggestion that there could be an Israeli government ever that would allow the Palestinians anything more than limited autonomy on tiny little areas within the West Bank is completely misguided or misleading. It is an impossibility. The state of Israel was created on the entire country, which they call Israel, others would call Palestine, on that day. Yet we hear constantly that Israel wants peace. We constantly hear that Israel wants peace, and they have to deal with these Arabs, and they have to deal with these terrorists. And what are you going to do? And the reality is, as Israelis, that the Arabs are going to hate us forever. There's nothing we can do to stop their hatred, so we always have to be strong. Now, my father, after he retired from the military, he began promoting this notion that Israel must respect the rights of Palestinians to self-determination, or a state within the West Bank and Gaza, and the rights of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens to equal rights, two things which have not been achieved. And to that end, he and several other Israelis in the mid-70s created an organization that was dedicated to this. And immediately after they created this organization, they were contacted by major figures within the Palestine Liberation Organization. Yasser Arafat's top people wanted to investigate and see if this was a real possibility. And they began this exchange, this dialogue, if you will, that continued for a very long time, for many, many years. They would meet at first in secret, they would meet in Europe, they would meet in North Africa, and so on. And they started talking about this idea of the two-state solution. Now, on the Palestinian side, these are officials of the PLO. On the Israeli side, these are people who used to hold high office, but now they're really renegades. And whenever they would return in the early years, in the 70s, my father would always go and report to the prime minister. The Israeli government would want nothing to do with it. In 1983, they went to Tunis and they met with Yasser Arafat. It was a highly publicized meeting. The photographers were there and so forth. And shortly after that, a law was initiated by Shimon Peres and was later passed by the Knesset that made these meetings illegal. It made it illegal for Israelis to meet with the PLO. Of course, they said, we don't care, you can arrest us, and they kept meeting. So this was throughout the 80s. Then 1993 rolls around and we have the Oslo Peace Accords. And Yitzhak Rabin, who was prime minister once again then, and Yitzhak Rabin, of all people, this war horse that had a record of war crimes from here to I don't know where, he's standing on the White House lawn with Bill Clinton shaking hands with Yasser Arafat. And many people thought, or many of us I should say, thought that this is the beginning, the dawn of a new era. Apartheid was falling apart, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union was falling apart, the world is changing. And there was some real hope created by this. However, it fell apart because the reality was that by 1993, the West Bank was fully integrated into Israel, and there was no chance that there could ever be a Palestinian state established. The purpose of Oslo was not a peace accord. The purpose of Oslo was to bring the Palestinians to surrender, and the Israelis were hoping that Arafat would agree.
We'll conclude the talk on next week's program. That's our show for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.
When the world has gone crazy and it's all becoming clear, when they're gunning down our comrades and it seems the end is near, as they're loading up the launchers for the tear gas grenades, we can take off our bandanas and kiss behind the barricades. When it's madness all